This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Independence Day weekend. Happy July 4th, Warren.
Thank you very much, John. Great to be with you on this holiday weekend.
I don't know what you guys tend to do to celebrate July 4th. We were together as a family out in California, enjoying a little bit of a whole lot of sun for my girls. They love the water. They're splashing around. The little boys getting used to it. So we've really had a good time. And of course, a lot of controversy over a big party thrown on the East Coast by the president, which showed a little bit of military muscle as well.
Well, that's exactly right. A lot of folks objected to him bringing out the military hardware for the 4th of July celebration. He's the first president since Harry Truman to actually speak at the 4th of July festivities on the Mall. And a lot of folks think that just the very presence of the president there turns it into more of a political event rather than an event that creates unity. And then when you add to that all of the military hardware, including a couple of tanks that, by the way, were so heavy that they actually had to be placed in a location and just left there because they would have torn up the streets of Washington and the Mall if they had tried to move them around. Did create the controversy. I will have to say, though, that, I listened to the speech, other than a gaffe that he made, kind of a misstatement, a misspeak that has gotten a lot of publicity. I did not find the speech personally to be overly political and, in fact, celebrated what we celebrate on the 4th of July, which is the heritage of our country and, what a great country we live in, and, of course, our military power and the role the military plays in keeping us safe and keeping us free is an important part of that.
Yeah, I think that's been a big part of his presidency is to talk about, obviously the greatness of America. The first campaign slogan, it's a reiteration here in the second campaign, but I appreciated that the speech wasn't a political stump speech. It clearly wasn't, and I thought he did the best job that he's done in terms of celebrating the country and kind of getting out of the way. Even David French happened to, who's been a longtime critic of the president, even had to acknowledge that there was really nothing here to this speech that was controversial, and even the show of military might is something that is pretty normal as well. So I appreciated that kind of balanced take from him.
Yep.
And thought it was pretty interesting. I had an interesting morning on July 4th. I was at the place where we are staying in Southern California, and experienced for the first time the ground move beneath me. I don't know if you saw that there was an earthquake north of Los Angeles that was pretty significant, but we felt it all the way down quite south of L.A., and that was a new experience for me.
Well, yeah, I lived in Alaska for a while, so I've been through a couple of earthquakes, and they can be a little unsettling. But this particular earthquake, I believe it was about a 6.4 on the Richter scale, which is pretty significant. But as you say, it was outside of L.A. There was some controversy, John, that you probably know more about than I do since you were there, that the city of Los Angeles has a text alarm system set up so that whenever there's an earthquake in L.A., folks in the Los Angeles area will get a text. Well, people in Los Angeles did not get that text whenever the earthquake that you're talking about went off, and there was an explanation for that, and that is that the earthquake in Los Angeles had to be above 5.0. This was a 6.4 earthquake, but it was far enough out of town that by the time it actually hit L.A., I think it was about a 4.6 or a 4.7 on the Richter scale. So it was an interesting kind of a turn of events. Nobody was, that I heard, was seriously hurt, though a lot of buildings were damaged. And a lot of the civil defense authorities in California and volcanologists and physicists in California used it as kind of a teachable moment to say that, what, this wasn't the big one, and the big one is coming.
The most dissettling part of me, as I immediately got on Twitter, because, that's the great source of meteorological information, but I figured I could, whatever it was, I could figure out, pretty quickly, and saw all the tweets about earthquake, and probably the most unsettling tweet was someone reminding us all that the Independence Day movie began just this way, with a earthquake in L.A. on July 4th. So I started looking for northern invaders, but we didn't get any. Hey, I want to begin kind of our the meat of our conversation here, remembering Dr. Norman Geisler. Dr. Geisler passed away this week. We try to do that here on Breakpoint and Breakpoint This Week when there's an individual of that kind of a stature that passes on, to talk a little bit about his life and his legacy. And in the world of Christian apologetics in our lifetime, he might be as prominent a figure as we have seen. A couple things to Dr. Geisler, and I know he was someone that you knew personally, also living in Charlotte there. A longtime connection with Southern Evangelical Seminary, which you've also had a connection to. And so I just wanted to mention the passing of Dr. Geisler and get your thoughts on that.
Well, Dr. Geisler was a remarkable figure. As you said, he was the founder of Southern Evangelical Seminary. I had the privilege of serving on the board of Southern Evangelical Seminary for a season. He wrote more than 100 books. Many of those books were co-written with others, which I thought was a very generous gesture on his part. So, for example, one of his most famous books, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, was co-written with our friend Frank Turek. And many of his books were co-written with others. And those co-writing relationships often became a springboard for those people to have launched their own careers in Christian apologetics. You know, John, I'm old enough to remember when Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, came out, which was, for many of us, that was a book that was kind of a defining moment in the world of Christian apologetics when it came out in the 1970s. But if you look at the footnotes of Evidence That Demands a Verdict, you'll see a whole lot of Norman Geisler there, that many of the statements that Josh McDowell wrote in Evidence That Demands a Verdict actually owed their genesis to Norman Geisler. It's also, I think, important to note that Norman Geisler in 1978 was one of the theologians responsible for what came to be known as the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, which drove a stake in the ground for many evangelicals, clearly asserting and defending biblical inerrancy at a time, in an era, whenever that was very much in doubt, very much in question. I think it was an important statement. I might even call it an indispensable statement for many of us. Helps us understand what biblical inerrancy really means, what it's all about, and maintain the authority of Scripture in the evangelical movement. And Norm Geisler was largely responsible for that statement.
Yeah, you know, on another podcast this past week, I was asked about Dr. Geisler, and I actually owe kind of a big chapter of my life to him, not in any kind of direct way, but really kind of an indirect way, probably what was to him a passing statement when he came to Bryan College, where I was a senior graduating in the Bible department. I think it was that year he was the Staley lecture speaker, and so we spent some time with him as a set of Bible majors, especially seniors, and somebody asked him about seminary, and he strongly recommended that we take a year off before just jumping right from college into seminary. And one of his reasons, I think, exemplified his kind of career, which is, you know, look, you guys have been in school for, 16 straight years now. It's time to take a break and get out, see what's happening in the world, and then you'll be a better student if you've done that. And Geisler was that kind of apologist, where he believed that the scholarship that he was doing needed to have, I think, play and application with people in the world. And so that's what I ended up doing. And he was quite willing to stand on those things which he believed, and he was a bulldog, really, in many ways, of biblical truth. And when he believed that people were straying, even some of his own former students, when he believed they were straying, he would be willing to call them out, and left quite a wake wherever he went. But when you think about a guy who co-wrote, or edited more than 100 books. That's stunning. And some of them, like you said, were bestsellers, like I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. 2 books that stay, prominently where I know where they're at on my shelves: When Critics Ask and When Skeptics Ask. Just a very useful guide First of all, to when biblical critics, kind of ask the questions about so-called contradictions in the Scripture, and then, of course, when skeptics ask kind of basic questions about Christian truth. It's just kind of a real easy handbook. Those are two books that have meant a lot to me. But it's a loss because of his stature, and he's one of many here that we are watching transition, and as a torch is passed to a next generation, and that certainly happened in the world and field of apologetics. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week with Warren Smith. I'm John Stonestreet, and we'll be right back.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Well, we're back on Breakpoint this week, and Warren, I wanted to tackle a topic that has been getting an awful lot of attention over this past month. Of course, June being LGBT Pride Month, but there's been a reference during the middle of this kind of whole movement over the last couple years to Stonewall. And Stonewall, of course, New York bar in which many people mark as the start of the LGBTQ movement. I don't think that's exactly true. I think there's certainly things that had happened before then, but at the same time, it gets mentioned as one of the great movements in history. It gets put into this category. President Obama, for example, I think was one of the first people to do this in his second inaugural address when he talked about Selma, Seneca Falls, of course, Selma being the civil rights movement, Seneca Falls being the women's rights convention, and then Stonewall, to kind of put that all together in kind of an alliteration. That really has changed things, and even led the New York Yankees this past year to mark that anniversary by placing a Stonewall plaque in Monument Park. I think President Obama added it to the National Register of Historic Locations. And you kind of think, when you think about all the great historic locations in America, and then here is the Stonewall Inn, there's some history here that's being kind of written, whether it's true history or not. There's history being written. There's a claim being made. There's a monument being erected. And I think it's worth talking about.
Well, I do too, John. And this is the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, and there's no doubt about it that not only is history being rewritten, it's being revised. Here are a few facts that may be helpful. In 1967, members of the Genovese crime family opened a bar called the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, and within 2 years, by 1969, it had become the largest gay establishment in the United States. The clientele were drag queens, transgender people, male prostitutes, and often homeless teenagers would gravitate there as well. Secondly, the reason the riots originally took place was because the bar was being shut down because it wasn't coming up to health code violations. In fact, folks that have studied the Stonewall Inn say that the only reason it remained open as long as it did was because the Genovese crime family was paying off police and other New York City government officials to look the other way and keep the bar open, even though it clearly should have been shut down almost from the moment it opened its doors. So to elevate that to the level of a historic place like we would elevate Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King preached, or Selma, Alabama, or Seneca Falls is really a gross misunderstanding of the place, and I think it degrades and denigrates these other noble places that we rightly should be celebrating in our country.
One of the interesting parts about it is when the riots actually broke out, it was the police officers that had barricaded themselves inside the Stonewall Inn, and the rioters were throwing rocks and bricks and then attempted to burn down the building with the police inside. as a way of getting them back for all the raids. By the way, I'm really grateful for the Gospel Coalition's piece. I think it was Joe Carter that wrote kind of a history of this, and it's really terrific. If you come to breakpoint.org and click there on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link to this terrific article by Joe Carter, just kind of outlining the history there. But, I guess the thing that I want to bring up here, Warren, is that, look, this entire movement from the beginning to the end has really been about historical and scientific revisionism. And so this is kind of another chapter, I don't think, in kind of the history of human rights. It's more of a chapter in this kind of tendency of this movement to rewrite the facts.
Well, I think that's right. And the narrative that has been created around Stonewall has been a remarkably persistent one. I mean, as you mentioned, John, whenever we were starting our conversation, President Obama used this famously alliterative statement, Selma, Stonewall, and Seneca Falls, to describe sort of this march forward, this progression of human rights. And to include Stonewall with Seneca Falls and Selma, I think, and not only to include it, but to have it included by the President of the United States at his second inaugural address. And we know what a sort of a famous tradition of second inaugurals there have been, going all the way, back to Lincoln and even before that to Washington, that it really elevates Stonewall to a place in history that I think it indicates the resilience of that story, the persistence of that story. It's one of those ideas, John, that you sometimes describe as a zombie idea. It should die, but it doesn't. It just keeps getting up and walking around.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, come to breakpoint.org, click on the link there on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. And we'll link you to this terrific article by Joe Carter at the Gospel Coalition talking about the history of Stonewall and how it's may not be exactly what we've been hearing in media reports and celebrations here of the 50th anniversary of those riots this year that we have been hearing, and why Christians need to know what the facts are. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet here with Warren Smith. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Well, we're back on Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. And just a few minutes ago, Warren, we were talking about the death of Dr. Norman Geisler. And this month at the Colson Center, two of the individuals that he deeply influenced, Sean McDowell, you mentioned Josh McDowell, Sean's dad. Mm-hmm. But Sean was also influenced by Dr. Geisler. And not only that, Dr. J. Warner Wallace, who is a friend and a senior fellow here at the Colson Center, their new book, really, I mean, there'll be some Norman Geisler in that book as well, but the book is called That the Next Generation May Know, and it's a terrific, terrific book, and we have it for you at the Colson Center for any gift to the Colson Center here in the month of July. Again, come to breakpoint.org, and we'll tell you how to get a copy of that terrific new book. Well, I want to change topics once more and talk about something that hit the news this week that I think we need to address. What's happening at the southern border obviously has been a topic of incredible consequence in our culture for the last several years. We got an email this past week from a young listener who challenged us, why aren't you saying anything about the border? And we reminded her that we did. In fact, we were one of the first to say something about it over a year ago when reports came that there was family separation happening. And one of the things that we've said over and over and over again is, look, we've got to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. And when it comes to what's happening with immigration, we've got to be able to do both. Is it possible to have a strong border and also not mistreat those who show up at the border? And I think the answer is not only yes, it's got to be yes. Is it possible to have a strong immigration policy and also reach out to those applying for asylum, especially Christian refugees, that was promised by the administration to them? Is it possible to do both? And the answer is not only yes, it's got to be yes, because that's what we have to be. We have to be the sort of people who treat people with dignity. And we can do that and have strong laws at the same time. And what happened, though, this week is something that needs to be brought up. There was a secret Facebook group that was revealed, made up of current and former Border Patrol agents. And on that Facebook group, there is racist, sexually explicit, very callous comments about migrants, Hispanic members of Congress, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her visit. There's a lot more to say here. There was a lot of disturbing, as the U.S. Border Patrol Chief Carla Provost said, disturbing social media activity. And it was really dehumanizing. It was, sexist, racist, and so on. It's a story that needs to be discussed because there's really no place for that in any sort of discourse nationally. But it's become a big story, and the question is it a big story? How big of a story is it? And how do we think through this?
Well, John, I don't think there's any doubt that the border crisis is a big story. Whether this Facebook group is a big story is not 100% clear to me, to be perfectly honest. There are about 9,500 people on that Facebook page, apparently. There are about 20,000 Border Patrol agents, but this included past and former Border Patrol agents. Among the people that are in that Facebook group, the 9,500, we don't know how many of those, what subset of those were actually the ones posting the objectionable content. So I am, at least with the Facebook story, unwilling to sort of, paint with too broad a brush here. But there's no doubt that when ProPublica, which is a nonprofit investigative news organization, broke this story, it immediately became front page news all over the country. And I do think it does give us an opportunity, John, to do what you just said, which is to affirm that the folks that are coming across the border, the migrants coming into the United States, the ones who want to come to the United States, whatever we might think of them and whatever we might think of U.S. policy regarding them, we've got to acknowledge, I believe, as Christians, first and foremost, that they are made in the image of God, that they're human beings, and that any effort, any attempt to dehumanize them in any way, I think as Christians, we should denounce that effort, that we should affirm their inherent dignity, we should affirm the fact that they are made in the image of God. And I think that this is an opportunity for Christians to offer an important contribution to this conversation and sort of return us to biblical first principles and an understanding of what it means to be made in the image of God and how we should treat our fellow human beings.
Well, that's got to be a given. This is where Christians begin, and we have to condemn any sort of language that dehumanizes the other, whether they're illegal immigrants, whether they're legalized immigrants trying to make a change or whatever. It doesn't matter if they're first and foremost human beings, as you mentioned. But the story has been reported as if this whole Facebook page is dedicated to this sort of comments. And we're all part of a million Facebook groups, as we all know, and some of them, are public facing, some of them aren't, and there's bad apples and bad players throughout Facebook. That's what we all see. And I think that one of the things that's been done is that the entire Customs and Border Protection group is being kind of painted with the same racist brush. This is a hard one. At the same time, we had religious leaders go down and visit detention facilities and describe it as completely opposite as what the media reports. At the same week, we had medical doctors go down and visit some of these detention facilities and describe it as worse than the media has covered. This is a mess, and it's a mess that goes way back. It's a mess that is now being tested even more because of the enormous influx of immigrants that are headed to the border, and we're going to have to fix this. And what we've got right now are pictures that are emerging, that are troubling, statements that are troubling, and also pictures and statements that are being doctored and used in ways that may not reflect reality. And this is a very, very difficult thing. What we can say is it's okay to have a strong border, and it is a must, it is a necessary thing to treat individuals with the respect and dignity that they deserve, and that includes family units as well. This is going to be a story that doesn't stop, and it's incredibly messy. And one of the things that I want to point out is the role that Christians can play in the middle of this, and that is running to the border, and you've written about that recently.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. There are lots of Christian organizations that, in fact, are making a very positive difference there. And Southern Baptists of Texas have been opening up their churches, for example, to provide shelter, to provide food. One particular church in Brownsville, Texas, I believe it's called the West Brownsville Baptist Church, has as many as 100 to 150 people a night staying in their fellowship hall. And it's just one example of many where Christians are running to the sound of the crisis, running to the danger, if I may put it that way, as Christians have done throughout history. John, you and I have talked about this throughout. We've quoted Rodney Stark as this behavior being a vital characteristic of the growth of the first, second, and third century church. And I believe it's an opportunity for Christians to shine and show the love of Jesus, to love our neighbors as ourselves, even today in the 21st century. This doesn't just have to be an artifact of history, but this can be a characteristic of the church today as well.
Well, you've been listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Come to breakpoint.org, click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to some of the articles and stories that we talked about in this week's program. You can also find out how to get a copy of the book That the Next Generation Might Know by Sean McDowell and J. Warner Wallace when you visit our site. Again, that's breakpoint.org. And thanks for joining us as we talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview. For Warren Smith, I'm John Stonestreet. See you next time.